All right, Morgan. So you and I both do a lot on social media, and I've got the list of some of the main questions I've been asked, and I want both of us to answer these because of our shared prison experience. How old were you when you went to prison?
I was 24 when I got arrested, but I spent 2 years in county jail, so I was 26 when I got to prison.
And I was arrested at 18, and I had just turned, no, actually, I went to prison the first time, the receiving prison, while I was still 18. I turned 19 in the receiving prison and then went to the mainland prison. How long did you serve?
4.5 years.
What was your original charge? What was the original sentence they were offering? Because yours was really extreme.
Yeah, so I mean, they had to assign me a capital attorney who usually deals with death penalty cases because the mandatory minimum sentence for drug delivery resulting in death, because it was my friend's overdose, is 20 years. Maximum life without parole.
And then they ended up lowering the charges to what you got.
Yeah, because, they did the investigation. They saw that I did not meet the traditional definition of a drug dealer.
Okay.
And actually at my sentencing, the prosecutor was agreeing to go with credit for time served.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And because his mom was opposing the prosecution and spoke at my sentencing. And then it was the judge actually who went with 5 years.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So I was sentenced to serve 32 years, but after 19 years, I received a conditional pardon. What do you miss most from your time in prison?
Reading a lot of books, mostly. I never read a book before going to jail. I grew up on the internet. I would do Cliff Notes for all of my assignments in high school. I read a lot, but it was like news and internet articles. And literally, when the U.S. Marshals finally found me, because I was on the run, and they were transporting me to jail, and at that time, I thought I was going to be doing 20 years. That was the minimum. I'm like, in handcuffs in the back of the cop car. And the one thing that brought me solace was like, oh, I can finally become well-read like I'd always meant to be.
That's wild. Before I answer, you were being chased by the U.S. Marshals, which is like this movie scene. Where did they finally catch you? What was the scene there?
Okay, so, and I didn't know this at the time, but my probation address, because I was on probation for felony drug possession, was my aunt's house. And she ran an in-home daycare. And the U.S. Marshals raided it and rappelled over the backyard fence into her daycare in front of all the kids. And my aunt is the one who told them that I was probably at this certain friend's house. And they were Mormon and they were like preppers. So they had a lot of really powerful firearms. And there I am, dead asleep at their house. And I get a knock at the door from the mom saying, Morgan, the U.S. Marshals are here for you. And I tried to jump out the window, but they had the house surrounded. I just ended up having to walk up the stairs, but it was really respectful. Like they didn't breach the door or raid, probably because there was a lot of guns there.
But think about that. They literally rappelled over the wall of a daycare, traumatizing children. But because these people had firearms, were willing to say, we'll do this in a civil way. That's insane.
Right. And I had sold a gram of heroin. That's what I had done, and that was their response. I was on the run for 6 weeks, and those were the worst 6 weeks of my entire life because you're just constantly terrified. You know it's coming. You're not gonna fully get away from the Marshals ever. And so I couldn't leave the house. Oh God, I had to pay people to go out and get my heroin for me because I was still addicted. God, the fear, just that fear constantly. Every time I would hear a noise, I'm like, this is it. They're here for me. And I actually have some PTSD just from that time.
Wow. All right. Well, what I miss most about prison was basically what you said. It was time. I had time to read. I had time to exercise. I remember back then I was so mad because I was like, God, I have all this time. I wish I had something to fill it up with. But then what that meant was I became creative in filling it up. I read 2 to 3 books a week. I exercised. I meditated. I became the best version of myself because I had all that time to fill. What was the hardest thing about prison?
Definitely the power plays from the guards. And I mean, the prison where I was at just got shut down last month for...
And the warden, the chaplain, all these people were arrested for sexual assault?
Yeah. So currently it's 8 of the guards were arrested for sexual assault. But I mean, I didn't experience that. That was just a consequence of what the guards were allowed to do, starting from the most basic elements of screaming and cussing at us and calling us bitches and just this really random enforcement of rules. Like they would literally, I would be walking back to my unit and they would be like, you can only walk counterclockwise around the yard, which was just not a rule. That was not real. But so I would have to like turn around. I would be sitting in a chair on the phone. They would walk up. No chairs allowed on the phone. Stand up now. Also, not a rule, but they were just allowed to exert this like random authority over our bodies. And what became of that later was just rampant sexual abuse to where the guards called the prison club.
Well, that definitely puts my experience in perspective because we did have some corrupt guards, we did have some abuses, but nowhere near that level or that regularity. I think the hardest part about me was feeling like I had thrown my life away, feeling like everything was lost and there was no redemption. And I think in a weird way, what made it worse was when I had people supporting me, I didn't feel worthy of that. I felt like I was somehow like fake or I was a charlatan because people believed in me. And I was like, man, look at everything I've thrown away. And it was really this sense of like hopelessness. It was this sense of like not being able to redeem or become anything other than what I had done. I really kind of internalized that. So the fact that I was facing that internal battle rather than literally a fight for external safety really puts things in perspective.
Yeah, I didn't have that as much because I'm just so fortunate that like Justin's mom was supporting me and I just had all of this support. And in reality, you know, people thought I was like a white collar criminal because of how I talk or present, but I was just a blue collar drug addict. You know, I was not some hotshot criminal out there like robbing people or committing fraud. You know, I was doing a 0.5 gram of heroin a day. So I didn't have that same mental battle going on.
But I also think it's like when we have that external challenge, we don't yet really get to the internal. Like it's only when we get a certain level of security, like weirdly, it was easier for me when I was scrambling for how I was going to get my basic needs met, because once that battle was gone, now all of a sudden I had to listen to those voices in my head and I had to kind of like reckon with my demons, and that was a challenge.
Yeah, that if you are stuck in survival mode, you cannot work on yourself. And I saw this in prison because so many girls didn't have outside support for their commissary. So they had to hustle, and they were hustling constantly. Ironing, making arts and crafts, making cards, stealing food from the kitchen, selling it. And I didn't have to do that because I had that life insurance money from my mom who died right before I got arrested, which means I wasn't able to shoot all the money up in my arms. I got arrested so fast. And so I could always like max out my commissary, you know, get the huge bag over my shoulder, walking back to my unit. And so I could focus on myself. And so I forced myself to read one book for pleasure and one book for self-improvement before I could read another book for pleasure, and meditating and exercising. And so I was able to do all this personal growth when so many women around me just weren't. And, you know, I thought I had a rough childhood growing up, you know, especially with my addiction. I was like, oh, it's because I've experienced all this trauma. But when I got to jail and started hearing the life stories of the people around me, I had to be like, oh, you know what? My childhood was great. Actually, A-okay.
But I think there's a danger there because I had the same experience. Like I thought my childhood was really good until I started recognizing some things. And some of the horror stories were there. But I don't think that one person's trauma takes away from our own. And I think it's really easy to compare. Then all of a sudden we start minimizing our trauma and we can't ever really heal and move forward because we don't feel like it's big enough or legitimate enough in comparison.
That is totally accurate. Like we can only compare our life experiences to our own life, right? There's not like some absolute factor for trauma. And my therapist tells me this same thing because I'm constantly like, no, I mean, I wasn't that traumatized. That can't be an explanation for any of my problems today. And he'll like walk through the different traumas I experienced and being like, those are valid. That counts. And I just have such a hard time with that because I think of these horror stories. But you're right. That doesn't take away from what we lived.
Exactly. Who was your favorite girlfriend in prison?
That is super easy. She was this Mexican woman, and this happened right at the end of my sentence. For most of the time, I wasn't in a relationship because I didn't like drama. Like I saw more domestic violence in prison than I've ever seen in my life. And she was just like one of my best friends her and her girlfriend were my best friends, and I hung out with them all the time. But I knew that girlfriend was getting out before her. And so I just like stayed close, and I knew like I was in love with her before she ever knew that I had a crush on her. And then her girlfriend got out, and, you know, that was my opportunity, but I'm so shy. I couldn't make the move. And I just remember we were sitting on the balcony in like one of those power trips from the cops. That day they were like, no chairs on the balcony. And so we're like sitting on the ground, and it starts to rain, and there's thunder booming, and she's like sharing this deep dark secret with me. And then I finally was able to tell her that I had a crush on her, but I still couldn't take it any further. And then the next day she was in my cell, and she went, I'm tired, I want to take a nap, can I take a nap on your bunk?
Oh wow.
And yeah, and yeah, we took a nap. But we were only together for 6 weeks because she was getting out. That was her release date. And it's so interesting to have this like intensely passionate relationship, knowing that it had an end date. But in some ways, that's the perfect relationship because it doesn't sour. You don't build up all of those resentments that are so normal in like a long-term relationship. And I think that's why I had such a hard time getting over it. Because in my memory, it was this
perfect version,
perfect relationship, you know, like never fighting. And, you know, it messed me up. She got deported. I was on probation, so I knew I couldn't leave the country to go visit her. But this is what made me do a study abroad program and apply for that State Department scholarship, which is how I ended up in Argentina and Uruguay studying drug policy, which is how I ended up living in Mexico doing harm reduction, which is how I'm now about to start a PhD. So if I wouldn't have had this relationship with her, my entire life would be different. But you know, I never saw her again.
Oh, wow.
When I lived in Mexico, we lived 30 minutes apart from each other, and I literally never saw her again. And when I got out and saw her social media, it broke me. Oh, she's one of those girls that entirely relies on her beautiful physical appearance to get by in the world. And obviously in prison, I couldn't know that. We're all wearing like prison khakis and we don't have social media. And she was just so smart. And just the way she saw the world was so incredible. And now all she does is post thirst traps. And got an enormous amount of plastic surgery, even though she was gorgeous before. And honestly, that helped me because then I was like, oh, actually, yeah, I don't want to be with her. Because like for the first year after I got out, I was just like pining.
Well, and so I can relate to that because I've gotten into a number of relationships since I've been out that had an expiration date. Like, oh, you're moving, or oh, you're doing this, or oh, we can't be it. And it feels amazing, but I then have a hard time letting go until it goes, you know, really wrong or until somebody really gets their heart broken. But so I didn't have a girlfriend in prison, but I did have a number of girlfriends who were on the outside and we corresponded. And there's one person I can think of in particular, and I have never experienced higher highs or lower lows. It was one of those relationships that you unfortunately know a lot about. And it was the first time I'd been exposed to that level of intensity. I really have never felt better about myself. I've never felt more in love. And I've also never been driven to the point of literally wanting to not be there, like literally wanting to end things. And it was amazing to see how that worked. And that was really the beginning of me recognizing the difference between love and like compulsive lusty obsession. And that was such an interesting thing.
You know, I don't have like the lusty part, but because of the example of a relationship that I grew up with, I see those peaks and lows of like, that's what it means to be passionate. That's what it means to love someone. And I'm working on that in therapy.
You and me both. When did you get out of prison?
I got out in 2018, but released to a halfway house where I was still a prison inmate. And so my prison sentence ended in 2019.
And what was the first thing you ate when you got out?
I was at the San Francisco airport after a taxi driver had just robbed me for $200. And I ate sushi. at like a restaurant stop because that's one of the things I'd always craved. And then like 10 minutes later, I was like, that is not filling. I am still starving. And I ate a cheeseburger.
So, well, first of all, I want to address, so like people don't realize the number one target for wage theft is formerly incarcerated people.
Yep.
And they are one of the highest populations to be scammed because they don't have any familiarity with technology, with the way things work. So like what happened to you with the taxi driver, that happens all the time.
Yeah, he knew I didn't have a cell phone. And absolutely could not. He literally picked me up at a prison. And so I was an easy mark. Because what was I going to do? Call 911 and say that the taxi driver was trying to scam me? I'm the one who would go back to prison in that situation. So I just had to pay him.
I got out in August of 2021. And the first thing I ate, I tried to eat that night. We went and picked up steaks. And then I literally remember we were on the way home. My mom was like, yeah, sorry, we won't be able to make the steaks tonight. It's too late. I was like, I've been waiting 20 years. But it didn't matter. She was right. I was so full of adrenaline because I only had an hour and a half's notice. This wasn't like a long planned thing. So finally, when everybody went to bed and I was awake and didn't sleep for 3 days, I was sitting on the porch. I was having this big emotional experience and it popped in my mind. I was like, I think they said they had ice cream. And I went back in and I got this pint of ice cream from the freezer and I didn't like realize it had the hard shell on top. So I kept sticking it in the microwave. So I ended up with this like ice cream mush milkshake thing and out on the porch, just like shoveling it into my mouth with this amazing grin and tears coming down my face and listening to nature. It was the most amazing thing I have ever eaten in my life and probably will remain that.
Yeah, I mean, I still eat ice cream like that. But see, my first year, I was still at the halfway house. So like, it was still like jail food and I would only get a good meal every once in a while. But just fresh fruit and produce. Like, I remember the first time I walked into the grocery store and there was just all of this fruit and produce. And I stopped there and I just cried because for years, you had to hustle and commit crime to get an onion, a tomato, and a bell pepper. And that was it. That was all that was available.
Yep, I remember that well.
Oh my God.
What was the hardest thing about getting out?
The hardest thing was, I mean, I got PTSD, but I didn't know that. Like, I didn't have that framework. And I got out. I immediately started at Portland State the week I got out. And I was also working full time, making pizza and just going, and not stopping to reflect. And I started having these panic attacks, like making pizza. If I couldn't get the order out fast enough, I would just like decompensate and have a panic attack. And within about 5 months of getting out, that got so extreme that I actually started experiencing paranoid delusions where I thought everyone walking down the street was staring at me and taking pictures of me. And I think this is from that time when I was on the run and thought the DEA was after me. And so anytime somebody had like their phone out texting, I was like, oh, they're recording me. And I think what started to happen is I was so intense, I would look at everyone and try to see like, oh, is this an agent? And that made people look back at me because they're like, why are you staring at me? But in my twisted mind, I was like, everyone is staring at me. And then I got in my car one day and I saw a microphone, this tiny microphone up on my visor. And I ripped it out and I freaked out and I'm like, they bugged my car. And I call my friend and she has me take a picture of it and send it to her. And she's like, Morgan, that's your Bluetooth mic from your aftermarket deck that you installed 3 months ago. That's been in your car for 3 months. And that's when I realized I needed help. And so I went into the VA and got like emergency PTSD mental health treatment. And that made me feel so bad because, I mean, the Veterans Hospital in the waiting room with me was people who saw combat. Like, how can my prison trauma mean that I deserve the same level of service as them? And I felt like I was taking away from people who had real PTSD. And then like my therapist had to tell me like, no, like you deserve to be here. You have a right to mental health treatment too. And I mean, I got better. I'm not saying I got healed, but it got easier as time went on. And
I mean, I think that goes back to what we were saying about how if you compare your trauma to somebody else's, it's never going to be enough.
Right. Yeah, that's a pattern, right? We just keep, I mean, and that's the human condition. We're always comparing ourselves to other people. Like, oh, this person's better at this than me, or this person's trauma is worse. And that's just not how it works. We have to turn inward. We can only compare ourselves to our past selves.
100%. And I think similarly for me, the hardest part about getting out of prison was the being overwhelmed. And it was, I was really glad. I talked yesterday with a group of people and a couple stood up and they said the same thing, that we have not stopped running since the day we got home. And that means we've accomplished a lot, we've done a lot, but it also means that we've had fucking breakdowns so many times. I mean, I remember 3 or 4 times in the first 6 months, just laying in the fetal position, shaking and crying and not understanding why and not knowing how to explain to anybody and not knowing what to do with that. And I was so grateful that it wasn't every time, but there were times where Courtney, who was then, my girlfriend and fiance, was amazing. Like, she was there and she could just hold space for me to do that. And I'd never in my life had somebody who could just hold space. Always had people who were angry when I was having a breakdown, or people who were trying to fix it. That just made it worse, because then all of a sudden I'm responsible for their feelings and I have to make them feel better because they're telling me how hard this is on them. Like, I needed that. And if I hadn't had that, I don't know how I would have done okay. And then probation parole did the craziest thing ever. And I haven't actually talked about this, so you're the first, well, you're not the first person, but first time on camera. I got a text message from my PO like 6 weeks after I got out. It said, "Hey, we need you to register as a sex offender." And I was like, excuse me? And so I called them. I was like, "Is this a mistake? What are you talking about?" They were like, "Yeah, no, sorry, it's just standard procedure." And so I call a lawyer, I call everybody I could, and I was like, what the F is going on? And this, again, I had a stable place to live, like I had money, I was okay. If I hadn't had those things, I was thinking about like, man, I'm gonna run to Mexico. There's no way in the world you are not doing this to me. So I went through this, and I literally went in and talked to the head of probation parole about this. And she said, "Yeah, sorry, it's just standard procedure. You just gotta go through the process. Like, maybe they won't find you to be one." I was like, I didn't commit a sex crime.
Yeah.
She said, no, but it doesn't matter. Like, this one crime you committed abduction and a robbery. And if that person was a juvenile, or if that person was, I can't remember the other designation, like, then it's technically a sex offense. I was like, but they weren't. Like, you can look at the record. Here is the record. She goes, "Well, it doesn't matter. They still have to do an investigation." And so I remember thinking, like, you were literally telling me you were going to make me register as a sex offender for not having committed a sex offense, that my life is going to change, that I'm not going to be able to go anywhere, that I'm not going to be able to do anything. I was ready to run to Mexico.
And that's the thing. Like, so many times when I was on halfway house, you could get sent back for anything. And then when you're on parole or probation, I remember one time, because I was doing a lot of CrossFit at the time, and I had drank a bunch of water after a workout, and my UA came up. And so I had to go to the PO's office, and my UA came up dilute.
Yep.
And that is something you can get sent back to prison for. Yeah. And I just panicked, and I had to stay at the office all day trying to pee again and again until it wasn't dilute. But like we were just saying, we're already struggling with mental health issues and having breakdowns. And then in that time period where our mental health is not great, they are stressing us out
with the most insane things.
Insane. And we are just supposed to deal with that. And if you relapse, if you use drugs in that moment to soothe yourself, or like you're about to bounce to Mexico.
Yeah. And I want to say, though, as terrible as that situation was, there was a hero in that story, and I don't want to get into who that is because I'm not sure what how much they want to say publicly. They basically called up everybody involved and cussed them out. This was a government official who said, "This is totally unacceptable. Who the F do you think you are? Do you realize what this is doing to this man's mental health?" I got a personal apology from somebody involved in this saying, "Mr. Crossan, we are so sorry. You are absolutely right. We should not have done this. We hope that you will take it in your heart to forgive us." And I remember being like, okay, you knew this from the beginning. If you had spent 2 minutes, you knew this was true, but it took somebody in a higher position of authority to basically say, "Hey, I'm gonna light a fire under your ass," to get you to say this is not okay. I could not imagine that. What barriers do you face today as a result of having been in prison or having a felony conviction?
So, I mean, like, I'm about to start grad school, and I got off the waiting list into graduate student housing, and I have to do an application for that next week. And they're about to run a background check, and universities have all types of restrictions against people with felony convictions. And I'm terrified I'm going to get denied that. And that's subsidized housing. It's like half market rate. I cannot afford to live in San Diego unless I can live there. And I'm terrified. And then also, like, I travel a lot for work. Like, I do global health, and so I'm traveling internationally, and I got denied for TSA pre-check. I got denied for global entry and Sentry, which means, like, when I'm crossing back in from Mexico, where I have to work, I have to wait 6, 8 hours in line sometimes when people who have Sentry can drive right through in 10 minutes. And like, it just doesn't make sense. They've never actually stopped and searched me. This isn't boosting security. It's just sort of like security theater and making me wait in line.
And similarly, so I was able to get employment. I'm really lucky that the city I live in, employment is not a big issue, but I had no trouble buying a house. But when my ex and I broke up and I had to rent, I got turned down by almost every rental group in Charlottesville because they said, no, literally no, people with a felony record need not apply, this, that. And I was only able to rent because I found a place on Facebook Marketplace with a private owner who said, hey, I don't do background checks. I don't do credit checks. I just need 3 references. And this is the kind of funny part. So I was like, cool. In case he Googles me, like I'm gonna get a reference from the 2 Commonwealth attorneys, so the county and the city. And then I got somebody else, I can't remember who it was, but like somebody in a position of authority. And I got a text from him the other day. I did a talk at a local church. I got a text from him, he's like, oh my God, I just saw your talk. I had no idea, like, hey, do you wanna get coffee? I'd love to talk to you about this. But I remember thinking like, didn't you think it was weird that I was having like the Commonwealth's attorney and like the chief of police write me reference letters? Like I kind of figured that would have given you a hint, but I guess he didn't think about it. But again, if it hadn't been that individual that had a different policy, I don't know that I would have found a place to rent.
Oh my God, if I didn't have the capacity to do like power plays and get people of authority to write me letters of recommendation, like that's how I got off supervision 4 years early, which is how I started to be able to leave the country, was a federal judge.
That's amazing.
Did it for me, essentially. And I had a bunch of letters of recommendation from powerful people.
And see, I struggle with that. Like I had a speaking engagement in England I couldn't go to because of probation, because I didn't know if they'd let me in. I had a speaking engagement in Canada I had to turn down because they, as well as Canada, wouldn't let me in. It was just like massive thing, and there are these limitations we don't think about. But
there's like harm reduction conferences in Canada and England and Australia all the time that I just can't go to.
That's crazy.
And it's like affecting my career.
On the other hand, what was the best thing to come out of your experience of going to prison?
The fact that the worst thing that ever happened in my life has already happened.
Oh, wow.
Or, if something worse happens, it's just a slight permutation of what came before. And if I can survive that, I can survive anything.
That is wild. I love the way you put that. I think about, for me, the best thing is prison was a place where in a way I found a different type of safety. Like it was dangerous, it was not a fun place, but it gave me the safety that I needed, because what I really needed was the emotional stability, or the separation from emotional instability. And in finding that, I was able to kind of start figuring out who I was for the first time. And I was able to make decisions for myself. I was able to get in touch with my needs. I was in therapy. I was meditating every day. I was exercising. I was reading. Like I was becoming the best version of myself. And it wasn't the prison that did that. It was the time that the prison allowed for. Like the prison didn't give me those books. The prison didn't give me those programs. Like that was all coming from me or from friends and family, but it gave me the time to do that.
Yeah, in women's prison, you're not really separated from emotional instability.
That's it.
Really not. There's fights constantly. It's always between girlfriends or ex-girlfriends. There's a lot of domestic violence. You're watching girlfriends just beat the brakes off each other. My cellmates fighting, me cleaning blood off my cell because it's count time and the guards are coming by. Yeah. There was just this constant level of drama that I was exposed to. And because I was the translator between different groups of people, I'm having to rapid fire translate drama constantly.
That sounds horrible.
Yeah. It meant I had a lot of friends, which is good. That's a protective factor. I never got in a fight my whole time. I didn't even have that level of drama. But I think just being exposed to it really affected me. My cell was right by the phone. Mm. And does that sound bad if you just think about it? You're hearing everything. You're hearing trauma. You're hearing a girl find out that her brother's been killed. And just these wailing cries of grief. You're hearing people have phone sex. And you can't, if you're seeing something you don't want to see, shut your eyes and it goes away. If you're hearing something you don't want to hear, what do you do about it?
Clog your ears? When it's funny because in men's prison, being by the phone meant there's going to be a fight there almost every day. Oh. You'd be walking out of your cell and somebody'd swing. You couldn't get away from that.
Oh yeah, no, we didn't have that. It was just emotional instability.
All right, so those are the questions that outside people ask. But what is one thing that you want to say that came out of your time in prison or from your experience now working with other people who have come out of prison? What is it that you want people to know?
That people in prison are nothing like you think. There are these smart, capable, talented individuals, particularly in women's prison, their level of criminality is so low. Like, we think we're putting criminals in prison. And if you get to know them, they're so clearly victims. And in women's prison, the level of criminality is so low. These are not gangsters. These were not people who were dangerous to society for the most part. You know, they're there for something their boyfriend did. They're there because they were the driver for a crime, or they picked up an envelope of money and took it somewhere else. Like, there's so few people there for crimes that are much more common in women or in men's prison. And there's so many intelligent, capable people, artists, just incredible, that have been there for 20 years, 10 years, and they're just sort of locked up and they throw away the key.
Yeah, and I would say something similar. There are obviously a lot more people who've committed crimes or who kind of lived a life of crime. But what I've found is that I've never seen a happy, healthy person decide to go out and commit a crime.
Right.
So what I saw was a prison full of people who, at the same thing, were intelligent and capable and artists and productive and hardworking, but who had so much trauma or so many struggles with addiction or mental illness, or having just lived in so much scarcity, they don't know how to exist in another way. And the problem is that we don't give them another way in prison. We're not providing them the tools. We're not like, hey, you got kicked out of class because you were fidgeting. Maybe we should have you see a doctor. Maybe you have ADHD. Or, hey, you're showing signs of abuse. Maybe we should get you help. No, we're basically like, hey, you've been bad. We're not going to address any of the underlying issues. We're just going to stick you here with all the other people who've been bad because they have underlying issues. And then we're going to let you mix in there for 5 years or 50 years. Then we're going to let you out into the world still having not addressed your underlying issues, and then wonder why we have an astronomical recidivism rate.
Yeah. My friend said jail is school for the hood. And, everyone asks, what did you do? Instead of what happened to you?
100%.
No little kid thinks, I'm going to grow up and be a prisoner, or I'm going to grow up and be a criminal. These are things that happen because of all these life experiences that nudge these people. And it breaks my heart, honestly.
Me too. Well, I'm glad you've been nudged in a different direction. You're going to this doctoral program and that you're going to be doing public policy on a global scale.
Public health.
Public health. I'll remember. And yeah, I'm proud to know you. You're one of the people who inspired me when I first got out, and I got to meet you, and I was like, man, one day I want to be like her. I want to be able to do the things that she's doing. And I feel like now I'm pretty close.
Well, now you're a lot cooler than me, actually, and a lot more successful. You see how I just compared myself to you?
Yeah, I do. We found that pattern, so we're going to stop that pattern. But.
Okay, all right, fine, yes. No, but also, I'm glad to know you. You're one of those people that challenges people's preconceived notions about who goes to prison.